Commissioner Doe,
Present.
Commissioner Munier,
Here.
Commissioner Parker,
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt.
Here.
And at this point, would anyone like to adopt the agenda? Anyone want to make a motion?
I motion that we adopt the agenda.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
At this point, we have written communications, and we have a couple of things from Western City, and something from Excellence in Motion, and something from Bay Area Monitor. Anything else?
The sustainability, you covered that,
I didn't.
Sustainability Awards invitation.
San Mateo County.
Oh, that's why I didn't get it. All right.
We didn't get it.
I forgot oral communications. My eyes just slipped down. Item D, and this is limited. Would anyone from the audience like to speak for the oral communications? No? All right. Then I will close the oral communications, and we'll move on to new business. Workshop introduction of the 2014 to 2022 housing element update process. Yeah.
This is the first of a series of Planning Commission study sessions updating the city's housing element. The main purposes of the update are to comply with state law and to figure out how to zone for the city's share of the regional housing need as recently allocated by the Association of Bay Area Governments. We will be using the existing 2007-2014 housing element as the basis for the update, revising as necessary to comply with recent changes in state law, keeping what works and changing what doesn't. As outlined in the agenda report, there are a number of components required by state law to be included in the housing element. These work together so the city can assess its housing needs, inventory the sites potentially available to meet those needs, address and remove governmental constraints to meeting those needs, and review and revise current programs as appropriate to meet the city's housing goals. The Housing Needs Assessment analyzes population trends, quantifies the city's projected housing needs for all income levels, including extremely low-income households, documents household and housing characteristics, including overpaying and overcrowding, and analyzes the special housing needs of the elderly, persons with disabilities, including developmental disabilities, and those in need of emergency shelter. The sites inventory and analysis identifies vacant sites and developed sites that could potentially be redeveloped, either from lower density housing to higher or from non-residential to residential or mixed use, to determine their suitability to meet the city's regional housing needs allocation. The inventory must consider any infrastructure or environmental constraints that would limit the realistic capacity of the sites for residential development within the 2015 to 2022 planning period. To meet the need for a variety of housing types at various levels of affordability, an analysis of the city's zoning must be conducted to determine if changes are needed. The state has identified certain minimum zoning densities that will be accepted without additional analysis as being adequate to accommodate the regional housing need for lower income households subject to a number of specific requirements. An analysis is also required of the potential and actual constraints upon the maintenance, improvement, or development of housing for all income levels and for those with special needs. Governmental constraints include land use controls, building codes, site improvement requirements, fees, and other exactions. Non-governmental constraints include the availability of financing, the price of land, and the cost of construction. An inventory of resources relevant to the meeting of housing needs must also be provided. Finally, the housing element must list goals, policies, and programs for the maintenance, preservation, improvement, and development of housing. Programs must include a timeline for effective implementation within the planning period. Quantified objectives for the maximum number of units by income category that can be constructed, rehabilitated, and conserved within 5 years must also be provided. In the study sessions to come, the Planning Commission will receive the latest data regarding population and employment trends, special housing needs, and housing stock characteristics, so Chapter 2 of the housing element, Community Characteristics and Housing Needs, can be updated. Then the various resources for meeting housing needs in Chapter 5 will be revised, followed by Chapter 4, Housing Constraints, and the review of the effectiveness and appropriateness of the 2007 to 2014 housing elements programs in Chapter 1. Next will be updates of Chapter 3, Land Inventory and Identification of Adequate Sites for Regional Housing Needs, and finally Chapter 6, Housing Goals, Quantified Objectives, Policies, and Programs. That concludes this presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions?
I have none right now.
No. So, I do have a question. The alternative adequate sites, amending California Government Code section allows market rate condominium complexes of 3 or more units that are converted to rental housing affordable to lower income houses to qualify towards meeting the alternative adequate sites provision. How is that new?
I think there were some adjustments to that to lower the threshold from, I think before it was 4 units to 3. We don't actually have any situations like that in Brisbane, so we've never had to deal with it. And I don't foresee it applying to our situation for this coming planning period either.
And then what about the AB 1103, which is amending section 65583, which allows foreclosed properties converted to affordable housing to lower income households to qualify? I just wasn't quite sure what that meant.
There must have been some situations elsewhere in the state where that has actually been proposed. There are some cities who have been making an effort to actually get into the foreclosure business themselves and try to save those units for their current occupants to continue to reside in.
Oh, okay.
But once again, I don't foresee that applying to Brisbane's situation in this coming planning period.
At this time, I don't know if this is the time to talk about it, but my understanding is that the number of lower income housing required by the city may be adjusted in this period. Is that something we should talk about now or not?
We'll be getting into that when we get to Chapter 3, I believe it is, which will be a couple of study sessions down the line. Basically, ABAG has released, and the numbers have been approved for this upcoming planning period for Brisbane. The total number of units that we are to demonstrate that we have zoning to accommodate. We actually still have zoning from this past planning period that we never fully implemented. So we're going to have to deal with those numbers as well.
So if they want, I guess this is in another chapter, but if they want to say they want us to have 35 instead of 450 or something, then we would use the 35 number or the 450 number, or how's this working for Brisbane?
I think it's kind of uncertain as to our. Normally, what you're required to do, obviously, is just have the sites, not worry about production of units, because really that is outside the governmental control. I suspect that when we go through the housing element, update and the review through the state, they'll be very interested in our performance in doing what we should have done in the last element, in the last cycle. The numbers we're talking about are substantially lower for this upcoming cycle. I don't think there's much worry about meeting those those sites, especially if you were absent the previous. But I think the previous will come back to in play through the conversation with the state about the housing element review. So I think when we get to that chapter hopefully we'll have a little better clarity as to, for everybody's sake, including staff's sake, how we sort of deal with what we were required to do in the last housing element that we haven't quite accomplished yet.
And just to kind of add to that, the City Council will be at their next meeting considering the annual report on the status of progress in implementing the current housing element. So you might want to take a look at that just to see where things stand currently.
So the analysis of population and employment trends, are they going to be using from 2010 on, or how are they using this analysis? Do you know? Is that from the last
What
census, or?
What we'll be using will be the data from the 2010 census, which actually wasn't available when we adopted the last housing element just at the beginning of 2011. So we have that data. The Census Bureau also does a 5-year kind of estimate that goes to 2012. The Department of Finance each year releases information on the number of housing units, and their latest update is due pretty soon. And HCD also releases each year the affordability categories, and that probably will be coming out sometime this spring. As well, ABAG does their projections on a semi-regular basis. The last one was in 2009. They have draft ones currently in process that we hope to have out as well sometime this spring before you have public hearings on the final draft. So there are a number of different sources of information. Some of them are more reliable than others. Some of them are just projections. Some are estimates. And the next study session will actually get into that in detail.
Okay. Do you know if the housing element component is going to require the form-based, what is it called, form-based? No. The different type of zoning, I forget what it's called.
You're getting the requirement for allowing residential units by right as opposed to under a discretionary review. That's my understanding that is still a requirement. So yes, that'll be in play.
And we haven't done anything on that at this point, or?
Well, we did have that Crocker Park TAP,
Charette, yeah.
and we suspect that report, when it gets published later in the spring, will, I think, become a starting point for that conversation of moving forward with the zoning we are already obligated to do under the prior housing element.
So they're not changing any of the zoning. And redevelopment funds, have they figured out what they're going to change? Or is there something new that's going to be implemented, or nobody knows at this point?
There really weren't any state law provisions or fixes to redevelopment as it previously existed, particularly in regard to low mod housing funds. There's a lot of alternative approaches that are under consideration. I think when we get to that component of the housing element, might be a good point for the city to weigh in on which kind of these policy options that have been, put forth in the last several years, if we're interested in any particular approach, and see if we can get some guidance on that. And so I think that'll be part of that particular chapter's analysis.
Okay, and then I know there were some funds for kind of tightening up the houses, and making them more weatherproof. Did we actually get any of that? And was the city able to give funds to people to kind of put in new windows? Or there, that was what, 2008. There was supposedly some money that was going to come through.
That'll be one of the things that we will check up on when we get to that section of the housing.
Okay, so then we would find out about that.
Right.
Because, it talks about weather stripping and, I was wondering where the money was supposed to come from for doing this for the low-cost housing, and if there had been any movement on that.
Check.
Now, the disability housing, we do have some housing that works with this group. Is that, do you have any idea if that's going to change, or are we going to be required to have more, or?
The state doesn't set specific targets for the number of accessible units other than what's required under the building codes. And we've approved projects here that have designated accessible units. So that would be nothing new. I don't know of any substantial changes in those requirements.
Does anybody else have any observations or questions?
I don't at this point. I need more information before I can ask questions, quite frankly.
I actually want to go back. Is it called form-based codes where the city, I can't remember, where the city kind of gives some guidelines about the type of architectural structures?
That's correct.
And that is still going to be required for that type of zoning?
Well, the requirement from the state is that you do not require a discretionary review process for residential projects to be able to count them toward your meeting your sites. So that's really the state requirement.
Can you say that again?
We could not just condition, we could say we impose an R3 zone, a multifamily residential zone, and require some sort of discretionary permit. The state would not recognize those as being potentially identified sites because there's discretion. The zoning may allow for a certain number of units, but through a discretionary permit process, the number of units may actually be substantially reduced. So the state doesn't allow you to get credit if you just apply zoning that doesn't have that has a discretionary review process. So the reason the form-based coding was proposed in the last housing element is a way of really front-loading the city's requirements. So there would be no need for a project-by-project discretionary review because up front the city's requirements for that particular project or projects within that zoning district would be defined up front.
So my question is, my understanding, my memory serves me, is that the zoning could only have housing in that area, or it could be mixed use, because I know that we're talking about Crocker Park as maybe certain areas being mixed use. Has that changed, or?
No, there's only a certain percentage of your required housing can be within a mixed use format. Some of it has to be in a standalone residential, and that's, I think the last time you were looking at that whole Southwest Bayshore district was going to be solely residential to meet that requirement of the state law. So we'll have the same issue with whatever we do for if we need to identify additional sites. This time it would be the same requirement, only a certain percentage can be within a mixed use format, the rest have to be in a standalone.
So if we have not met the 450, we've made no progress on that particular number. I forget how much it was. Was it over 400? And my understanding was there was a correction, that somehow there was a mistake and we didn't
That is not correct.
That is not correct.
The 400 units was, 401 was our RENA allocation from last cycle, and it remains on the books as our allocation from 2007 to 2014 housing element. There was no adjustment to that number.
So if they decide that we should have 151 addition, then we have to come up with more space, or?
Well, I don't want to steal a lot of the thunder of what you're going to be hearing another day, but the unit count is it 83?
83.
83 is our requirement for the next 8-year cycle. So instead of 401 units, it's 83. So.
Well, okay, that confuses me. So that is what I've heard, but I don't quite understand. So we only have to now provide area for 83 instead of the 401?
There's quite a large, in my own mind, there's a little uncertainty as normally in housing elements, you kind of start fresh. You know, you had the last element and you were supposed to do certain things, and whether you did them or not, that was whatever the results were, and then you would start over fresh at the next one. I'm not convinced that in reviewing this element that our past performance isn't going to come into play. Mm-hmm. We haven't had that conversation with HCD yet, which is the state. So that's something really to be worked out with them. And I wouldn't say we've done nothing. I would say we've certainly actually produced more housing units in this last cycle because of the change in economic conditions and the project up on the Northeast Ridge, for example. You know, there's actually been much more housing produced than there has been in numerous previous housing element cycles. So they have that. We have the, how we're proceeding forward with the TAP and the change in sites where we think are appropriate for residential versus what was shown in the 2007 element. So, I mean, I think there's going to be a conversation with the state about what we've done and how we're proceeding on this. I think it's very clear that still the city's aware of our obligation, and we're moving forward at our at best diligence we can, but these things don't get done overnight. So we'll see how the state reacts. I don't really know at this point.
I have a question. Why do they only allow a certain percentage to be mixed use and the rest has to be standalone residential? I mean, what difference does it make?
I think that's a very good question. That came up. They came up in the last cycle because people would ask the same question: "What does it matter?" And I don't know that anybody at this table ever got a satisfactory response from the state as to why they have a lot of rules they impose on us, and frankly, some of them are intuitive and make some sense, and a number of them don't necessarily make a lot of sense. So, we kind of take the good with the bad when it comes to our housing element requirements from the state.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Who decides the number of units? Is it the state that dictates that, or what? What's the procedure involved?
That's actually been delegated from the state down to ABAG. That's our 9-county Bay Area region, local entity, and they define by jurisdiction what those units for each jurisdiction within the 9-county Bay Area region.
What's the logic they use in terms like from 400 to 85 is quite a reduction.
It is quite a reduction.
Why we had 400 in the last cycle and only 85 now?
Again, that's what we say. These things sort of vary over time. The methodology, again, being not so involved in the previous housing element, but it seemed to weigh the issue of jobs housing balance quite heavily in 2007, and because the city is considered jobs rich and housing poor, that some people would say the city was penalized because of that, and we picked up a higher unit count than we might have if we were in a different condition, where we had
So in
more
this-
housing and fewer jobs. But in this latest housing element, or the RENA, the housing allocation is more focused on housing around transit
Oh.
and trying to an infill, as opposed to, the jobs housing being a much less important component of what they, where they were designated housing. And a lot of it was going into priority development areas where, again, those are jurisdictions that are embracing taking, more housing. They want more housing near transit. So, it's a different sort of methodology that leads to a different outcome.
But in that case, if that's the criteria, then most of the development near the transit will be mixed use, the way I see it. And then you have a limitation on that, so how that's going to work. And also, we're coming up with this random number, 400 last cycle. There is no penalty for that. It's just a number that was given, and we may have only 2. And nobody says why or what was the reason or why we come up with these numbers anyway. Just an exercise. I mean, to me, it doesn't make any sense when you say 400 and you generated only 10. Why bother to give the number anyway?
No, I think you raise a lot of good rhetorical questions about, we've all been through a number of housing element cycles at this, and we all face that, and it becomes, what you're talking about, if you're really talking about production of housing, that a local government's control of that is really relatively limited. We could have all the property in the world zoned for residential, but if the market isn't supporting the development of residential, it doesn't matter. We're not going to produce a housing element. Adopting a housing element has never created a stick of housing being built, and I think we all recognize
it's just
that.
an exercise. To me, it doesn't. I mean, I went through the last 2 times, and all I see is just an exercise to submit something to the state, and has no merit at all. Because if they really wanted to decide what needs to be done, they have to look at the real picture as to how many lots are there, and whether there is possibility of development, not based on the employment and all of that. That has no relationship to how people are going to build or how many people are going to build. So to me, then the last exercise we went through, it was a very quite arduous task, and I think thanks to Tim, he helped us go through that, and we're going to go through the same thing, and then 85 numbers, and I doubt that we're going to meet that either. I think realistically maybe 10 or 15, or not even that much. How many we had in this last cycle?
Yeah, I haven't done a total yet.
Not many.
I don't have a hard number, but we have the Northeast Ridge final phase, which is 71 homes, and they're making good progress on that. And we had the previous last few of the Northeast Ridge before this, and several others that counted towards this current housing element. So I don't know. I wouldn't put it over 100 by any means, but it depends on the timing of when the Northeast Ridge finally is completed. But we'll have quite a few actually built.
That was the only project that was in works in Northridge. If we didn't have that one, then we will wind up maybe with less than 20.
I think that's
And then here they're asking us 400, so there's no correlation.
Yeah, and again, just to remind, and we'll get into this in more detail, the city's obligation is to have the sites identified that will accommodate these numbers, not to ensure that these get built. So that's really what we're talking about, is providing the adequate zoning and be able to demonstrate that our zoning regulations will allow for this yield that they're interested in. And
But there
they-
should be some kind of accountability, and if the state funds are being used to generate this paperwork and so much of this work from all the cities and also the state planning office review all this, what's the benefit of that to the citizens? Zero. So why we spending all these dollars to do this? And that's what I don't understand. And that's why last cycle also I was not very happy to go through all this to 400 units. And in my mind, I was not sure why we even putting 400 units and where did this number come from and what's the purpose for that? And it's a waste of taxpayers' money, I think.
So we're really just writing a story to put it on paper,
Yeah, that's all it is.
right? So,
Well, I think there's a lot of policies and programs that are not related to the sites, the site identification. You have, programs that are intended to help with affordability or maintenance so I wouldn't just dismiss the whole thing as an exercise. I mean, there's a lot of good policy language in there that stems from the general plan as was currently adopted. The number of things have been implemented over time. So I think, when Tim will go through those on a chapter by chapter basis, I don't want to get completely wrapped up around the number of units because that's a piece of the puzzle, and it often is the most problematic for the city to be able to identify, and that's why people get hung up on it. But there is other, I think, very valid policy direction and programs that are included. So,
Well, I understand the requirements for the architectural design and all that kind of stuff, but that can be put in the planning guidelines. But, to have every cycle, every 10 years or 5 years, whatever the cycle is, go through this exercise doesn't make sense. And every year you have to review that, right? Every year is to submit that. So now that much more paperwork and it doesn't go anywhere. No value to that. So, but I'm not running the planning office in Sacramento, so. But we will go through this exercise, I hope.
So,
And Tim is here, so he will help us. He's gone through that many, many times.
so I think you've adequately addressed item number 2. I think that's what we've been talking about is if a city in the prior planning period failed to identify, so we identified or make available adequate sites. Well, we sort of didn't. To accommodate its previous RENA, then the city shall, within the first year of the planning period of the housing element zone or rezone adequate sites to accommodate the unaccommodated portion of the regional housing need allocation from the prior planning period. I think that's what we've been discussing. At least in my mind, we've been discussing it. So that means that we didn't ever really set up the zoning. So we need to go back and talk about maybe zoning with the state. Is that correct?
No, we'll go ahead and move forward with, again, based on the TAP and the results of that. That was going to be the kickstart for our rezoning, and it remains the kickstart of our rezoning process. So revisiting with the state, I think that'll come in how the narrative of this housing element characterizes our what we achieved from the last housing element and what goals or requirements we had that were unmet. But in terms of our zoning requirements and our zoning process, that will move forward from the TAP.
Okay.
Well, I think we've done an adequate job of included a diligent effort by the local government to achieve public participation. I think we've done that. So I commend the city for doing that. We certainly have tried.
We'll see when we start the next phase how many people
Yeah.
show up.
No,
what's the interest in the community for this particular part of the process.
I think that's all I have to say. Maybe not, but I think that's it.
Still no action.
Another 2 times it doesn't work.
Move to the next item now.
So item G is items initiated by staff, the Planning Commissioners Academy in Burlingame, as staff.
We have, I believe, confirmation from 4 of the commissioners who will be attending. I don't know about Commissioner Munir, whether you'll be attending or not. I won't put you on the spot tonight, but,
I'm not
we-
sure yet.
okay.
'Cause,
If you can just get a hold of Trish
Yeah.
Taylor from our office.
I'll let her know.
Okay, that'd be great. And when we get
Through
more
the chair.
information, I'm sorry.
If I may, through the chair, I believe that the closing day for registration is Monday, so,
Okay.
so you know.
This coming Monday?
Right.
And how much it costs?
I don't recall.
Yeah, in the last budget, the council put enough training budget,
500?
since there's no travel in this particular, with this location, we were able to send off all the commissioners. So,
Okay, because what I'm looking at is in case if I do admit that I'm going to go and something comes up, I don't want to waste the city's money. So that's what I was looking at to see how much it cost.
You
Now
you may
Karen
look
says
at,
it's $500. I don't know. That sounds like pretty high, but
you may look at the schedule. It may be possible to register for a single day instead of the whole conference, if there's
yeah,
something
that might be a
piques your interest.
possibility also.
And then the other item was, the council will be making the appointments hopefully this coming week in their next meeting for the commissioners' terms who had expired or expiring. So based on that, we would schedule the selection of the commission officers in one of the later meetings in March. So just kind of to be aware of that, and you can think amongst yourselves how you want to work that out. Lastly, it's not on here, but just informationally, the 8 Thomas appeal will be heard Monday night at council as well. So it should be a
This
interesting
Monday?
evening.
Okay, I had the questions for all the planning commissioners here. How
Are
we
we moving on
how we
to-
going to do this? Are we going to be there and present our position, and who's going to do it? Is it possible to come up with some kind of a strategy here so that the council gets our message correctly, that why we,
Well, I think all our materials included in the
yeah,
agenda.
but it's not a bad idea to be there and explain some, because sometimes people don't.
Well, I heard
Great.
Council Member Lentz did ask that we either, that he would like more of our thinking on why we chose the direction that we did.
So I think the chairperson will be the one doing this. Or,
Well, I was going to attend the meeting, so.
yeah, but
I'm attending the meeting.
I'm
I
planning.
plan on it as well.
Oh, okay.
You attending as well?
I'm gonna try, yeah.
I will be there.
Looks like we'll be there.
All right, so, great.
But obviously, I will give the priority to the chairperson. If the questions is asked for the planning commission's decision, reasons behind that, and you can ask for our help
Mm-hmm.
if you need to
Right.
clarify. We will be more than happy to assist you.
Thank you. Maybe I will phone or write to people, email people.
Actually, I just checked, and I actually have a conflicting meeting at 7 that night. So could I just do you want me to do a summary and then I can submit it to you, or is what we said in the, because we said a lot of,
We said a lot,
provide extensive explanations as to why we made the decisions. I think each of us spoke on it very clearly and succinctly. So do you want me to do a summary of it, or?
Sure.
Okay,
If you could email it to me, that'd be great.
sure.
Yeah, you got our full support. 100%.
So you're going to email me, or
I'm going to be there
you're going to be there, so you'll come and speak?
if you want me to.
That'd be fine. I'd like to hear.
See how it goes.
All right.
Are there any candidates for the planning commissioners? How many people applied, you know?
I understand there were two candidates.
Other than the two here?
No, just two candidates, period.
So it should be an automatic selection.
Not necessarily?
Not necessarily. If they want us, I don't know. I better not talk too much. Maybe I will be the one to go.
Keep talking.
Speak your mind.
Speak my mind, of course.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So then there are not going to be any interviews, I guess.
I think
Not that I'm aware
There's
of.
no need for, right?
They would have contacted you if they were going
Right.
to do that.
I haven't heard anything.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
well, if you were interviewed, that was your opportunity to bring up your feelings about.
Right.
Last time that's what happened. I
Yeah,
thought
I
I
did
was
myself.
interviewed, but they wanted me to interview them. So I said I was not prepared for this. He said, what kind of concerns you have about us? I said, I thought I was there for my interview.
I won't talk about my last interview.
Okay.
But I must say that it was a good opportunity to air it out, but the thing, I don't know how far it goes. But, I brought out about the plan, the general plan. That was 4 years ago, the appointment, and it's still, there's zero movement on this.
Anything else from staff? Any items initiated by the commission? Any subcommittee updates?
No.
No, the technical assistance panel was fun to be part of. We'll hear more of that in the springtime, right? I think it was really a really good use of our time. I think they asked some very interesting questions. And I think we will get a lot of food for thought, knowing that there's a lot of, we don't want growth, but we want all these amenities and all of those kind of things, and how they conflict. It's like, Trader Joe's won't come here unless there's X amount of people living here, and we don't want X amount of people living here. We, meaning the people in Brisbane so far have spoken that way. So that's all going to be very interesting to see how that washes out. It was very interesting conversation, for sure.
Any update on the traffic committee? Did they come up with any kind of goals and identified any projects that need attention?
I was talking to their staff person today just offhandedly, and I guess they have some sort of safe routes to schools sort of they're looking at, and I think they have a recommendation to the full council. They'll make a presentation. I don't think anything's been scheduled yet or anything, but that's, I guess, the one thing they've been working on. I'm not really aware what else they're.
I thought the safe route to school, we already done that. All the modifications at the San Bruno was part of that. So I don't know why they're still further looking into that. I thought they're going to look into the other safety, related projects that were brought before the council, and they should look into this. So I'm surprised because you know, those stopping lights and all of those, they were part of that money that came from that particular federal program. So,
The comment period for the draft EIR has closed, and the comments are on the website. I assume everybody's has seen them or.
Very interesting reading.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
it's on Brisbane's site, right?
Mhm.
I haven't got an opportunity to look at
Oh,
it.
it's very enlightening reading. You should.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
on the city website.
Are we going to get the copies of that, or before the next go around?
Certainly, you can. It would all be packaged up into a document. I wasn't planning on printing them out separately at this point.
No, it doesn't
And,
need to
I mean,
be.
they're all
Yeah.
available online.
Yeah.
You can certainly do that if that's your pleasure. But
Yes.
Hmm.
Don't
And do we have any idea of the schedule at this point of how long it'll take for the?
I think it'll be a number of months.
Uh-huh.
You know,
So
I
maybe
actually haven't seen a formal schedule estimate from the consultants yet, but I think it easily roll easily into the summer, late summer.
Can I ask you a question on procedure relative to that? So, just reading a couple of documents, to me, is going to generate hundreds of pages of response. Or how does that work? I mean, when you look at, for example, the water districts, I mean, that's a very convoluted response from them. I mean, how does one proceed past that?
What the consultant will do is they'll take a letter, and some are really structured very easily because each comment is kind of a discrete one-off thing. And then that'll be keyed, so that'll be response, letter 1, comment A. And they'll be marked as comment A, and then there'll be a response to that particular comment. Same with the letters that are just kind of flowing narrative. They
Yeah.
may break it into 4 different comments and say, although it was all in the same paragraph, there were 4 discrete comments. They'll be labeled. So when you get the document, you can look at a given letter, you can see how they broke up the comments, and then you'll see a response that's discrete to each of those comments.
And the response time then, once all these comments come in, then responding, how's the next phase of that then work relative to?
Well, the
How
next
much is-
phase, obviously the council can weigh in and do it because whatever they want to do. But normally what happens in an EIR is the next stage is there's no more written back and forth. At that point, the people who wrote the letters have the comments. They wrote the comments. They have the responses. They would normally come before you and testify. That's really the next step, is typically coming to the planning commission. There's no more iterations of written back and forth on the document formally. That's just not how it goes. So you're basically will have the benefit of the written draft, the letters, the responses to the letters, and then the people at the meeting will, be feeding back as to why they thought the response was inadequate or so that's really is going to end up in the commission, sort of part of your deliberations and the testimony that's offered before you.
So are we going to have divided up into special sessions just for the DEIR and then other sessions for other business?
I think that probably makes a lot of sense. I think when we get closer to having an actual publication date, we'll want to make sure we work with the commission and the community at large to make sure it's a kind of a very clear what your sort of schedule is and what kind of schedule you're trying to meet and what's going to be discussed at a given meeting. Otherwise, I think if you kind of start talking about the planning and the environmental document and all in one sort of meeting, it could be really hard for everyone to follow. So I think the idea of having a lot of structure to it, it's going to be these two meetings, or however many meetings it has to be to focus on, and maybe even just series of environmental topics. You may not even say tonight, like when the presentation, there were certain nights that were devoted to certain topics of the EIR, and that might be the same kind of way to go about kind of managing your workload and trying to keep focused and keep it organized. But we'll work with the commission, whatever, we can do to make your job as easy as it can be in this case.
I wasn't expecting easy.
Not easy.
Anything else?
That's it.
No.
All right, the next item of business is adjournment to the regular meeting of March 13th, 2014 at 7:30 p.m.
I make a motion.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good to see you again,
Yeah, good to see you.
young man.